Sarah Packer. Sarah Packer worked as an adoption supervisor for Northampton County children, youth, and families in Pennsylvania. She spent her days reviewing case files on vulnerable children in foster care. She knew exactly which warning signs would trigger an investigation, which disclosures would escalate to law enforcement, and which ones could be quietly closed without consequence. What nobody knew at the time was that Sarah Packer was using that knowledge to protect herself, because the child in the most danger in all of Northampton County was living under her own roof. Her name was Grace. She was adopted from Berks County Foster Care in 2007. Grace had been placed with Sarah and her then-husband, David Packer, a household that had fostered roughly 30 children over the years. On the surface, it looked like a home built on service. Underneath, it was something else entirely. In 2010, a former foster daughter discovered photographs on David Packer's phone showing him abusing another foster child placed with the family as a teenager. David eventually pleaded guilty to multiple counts of abuse and misconduct involving Grace herself. He was designated by the court as a danger to children. Sarah was fired from her county position in April of 2010. She was flagged by Pennsylvania's Child Line Registry as aware of what was happening in her own home. And yet, she was never criminally charged. She never lost custody of Grace. Because Grace had already been legally adopted, she carried the same status as a biological child, and no ongoing welfare checks were ever mandated. This decision seemed small at the time. It wasn't. By 2016, Sarah had moved in with a man named Jacob Sullivan, and together they had developed a shared fantasy about harming Grace. Sarah spent weeks preparing, secretly medicating Grace's food to make her compliant. On July 8, 2016, they drove Grace to a secondary rental property in Quakertown. What happened inside that house was described in court filings as deliberate, premeditated, and carried out by both adults together. When Grace looked toward her mother for help, Sarah told her, in words later repeated at trial, that she could not help her anymore, and that this was now her life. What happened next was described in court filings as premeditated. The couple restrained Grace, confined her, and left her alone for roughly 12 hours. When they returned and found she had survived, Sullivan took her life while Sarah stood beside him. Sarah reported Grace missing on July 11, 2016. For 3 months, she continued collecting Grace's $712 monthly disability benefit and even filed a continuing disability review in August. In October, the couple disposed of Grace's remains and drove 75 miles north to dump them near the Francis E. Walter Dam in Luzerne County. On Halloween night, hunters found what was left of her. A multi-county task force led by Bucks County District Attorney Matthew Weintraub identified Grace through dental records in December of 2016. When Sarah was charged with obstruction, the couple attempted to take their own lives. In the intensive care unit, Sullivan confessed to hospital staff, calling Grace a nightmare. In February 2019, Sullivan pleaded guilty to all 18 counts. Sarah testified against him, describing Grace as a non-entity she had hated. On March 28, 2019, a jury sentenced Sullivan to death. Judge Diane Gibbons added 44 to 88 additional years and told him that he had no soul. The following day, Sarah pleaded guilty to first-degree charges and received life without parole plus 52 to 104 years. The judge told her that the word "mother" coming out of her mouth was a profanity. Sullivan passed away on April 30, 2020, from a cardiac aneurysm at SCI Phoenix while still on death row. Sarah Packer remains in Pennsylvania Department of Corrections custody. Grace's estate reached an $8.9 million settlement with the agencies that placed her. A state fatality report found that caseworker loads had exceeded guidelines and that information had never been shared between the 5 jurisdictions that all had contact with Grace. Pennsylvania lawmakers introduced a legislative package in her name, and the unified statewide child abuse information system mandated by House Bill 321 is still being built, with rollout targeted for late 2025. A system that was supposed to protect Grace Packer instead lost track of her across 5 counties. The Hart family, up next, crossed 4 entire states, and the system lost track of 6 children at once. Jennifer and Sarah Hart. On November 25, 2014, a 12-year-old boy named Devonte Hart stood crying at a rally in Portland, Oregon, holding a sign that read, "Free Hugs." A photographer named Johnny Nguyen captured the moment. Devonte in tears, embracing Portland Police Sergeant Brett Barnum. The image went everywhere. It became one of the most shared photographs of the decade, a symbol of healing and hope in the middle of a national conversation about race and policing. People saw a family full of love. At least, that's what everyone thought. If you had asked anyone in Woodland, Washington about the Hart family, they would have told you it was a beautiful story. 2 mothers, 6 adopted black children, a life lived at protests and music festivals, all curated across a Facebook presence Jennifer Hart called the Hart Tribe. They had no idea. Pay attention to this next detail, because it explains everything that followed. After moving to Oregon in 2013, a family friend reported that Jennifer had forced the children to lie in bed, wearing sleep masks for 5 hours straight after they ate pizza at her home. Oregon's Department of Human Services compiled a 30-page investigation. Caseworkers noted the children were undernourished and small for their ages. Hannah was missing her front teeth. The case was closed as unsubstantiated. By 2017, the family had relocated to Woodland, Washington. Their neighbors, Dana and Bruce DeKalb, began noticing that Devonte would repeatedly come to their home, asking them to hide food for the children. Hannah once jumped from a second-story window and ran to the DeKalbs for help. On March 23, 2018, the DeKalbs called Washington Child Protective Services. A caseworker visited the home. Nobody answered. A return visit was attempted on the morning of March 26th. By then, it was already too late. Around 3 in the morning on that Monday, March 26, 2018, Jennifer Hart drove a 2003 GMC Yukon onto a dirt turnout along the Pacific Coast Highway near Westport, California. Accelerated from a dead stop to roughly 90 miles per hour with no braking whatsoever, and launched the vehicle off a 100-foot cliff. There were no skid marks. The airbag control module confirmed full throttle acceleration the entire way. Everyone in that vehicle perished. Jennifer, Sarah, and all 6 children. 3 of the children's bodies were never recovered intact. Devonte has never been found and is legally listed as missing, presumed dead. Jennifer's blood alcohol level was above the legal limit. Sarah and at least 2 of the children had elevated levels of diphenhydramine in their systems, consistent with sedation. Sarah's browser history, which she had repeatedly tried to clear, contained searches about lethal dosages, drowning timelines, and no-kill shelters for dogs. On April 5, 2019, a Mendocino County special jury of 14 unanimously ruled the deaths a murder-suicide. The adults by suicide, all 6 children by homicide. With no surviving perpetrator, there was no criminal trial. The institutional failures were staggering. Texas had routed the 2009 placement through a Minnesota-based agency despite objections. The interstate compact on the placement of children failed to track the family across state lines. Oregon never notified Washington when the Harts relocated. There is still no national database sharing child welfare histories across states. Oregon passed Senate Bill 1605 in 2020 to restrict out-of-state placements, but no comprehensive federal overhaul has passed. The photograph of Devonte is now cited as a cautionary example of how curated imagery can hide what is happening behind closed doors. For a while after the Hart case, the conversation was about interstate oversight. People talked about databases and communication protocols. That conversation faded. And while it faded, a boy named Carry-On Franks was slowly disappearing inside a house in Vancouver, Washington, barely an hour north of where the Harts had lived. Felicia Adams and Jesse Franks. On the Friday after Thanksgiving, November 27th, 2020, a woman named Felicia Adams drove an unconscious teenager to Peace Health Southwest Medical Center in Vancouver, Washington, rather than calling 911. The boy was pronounced dead roughly 14 minutes after arrival. The initial cause of death listed bilateral pneumonia, and the case might have ended there. Then, within hours of bringing him in, casino surveillance cameras captured Adams and her husband, Jesse Franks, gambling at a nearby casino. The teenager was Carry-On Franks, 15 years old, severely developmentally delayed, diagnosed with severe autism, nearly nonverbal, legally blind, and living with a rare genetic disorder. His last documented pediatric weight in 2019 had been 115 pounds. When the receiving funeral home contacted the Clark County medical examiner to raise concerns about the condition of his body, an autopsy was ordered. The results, released May 14, 2021, were unambiguous. Carry-On had not died of pneumonia. He had died of starvation and neglect. He weighed 61 pounds. That is a teenager who lost nearly half his body weight in roughly 18 months. 3.5 years before Carry-On died, Washington's Department of Children, Youth and Families had received its first warning. On April 21, 2017, an anonymous caller reported food withholding in the home. Closed. On October 17, 2017, the same caller reported food being withheld as punishment. Closed again. On November 20, 2020, just days before Carry-On died, a third call came in from Adams's own sister, Latricia Brown, who described the children as emaciated and Carry-On specifically as a walking skeleton who stole food whenever he could. You would think someone would have said something. Someone did. 3 times. And 3 times the system closed the file. On November 21, 2020, one day after that third call, a CPS caseworker visited the home. The 2 younger adopted brothers, then 13 and 14, described a pattern of physical punishment, confinement to their bedroom at night behind an installed turn lock, and ongoing mistreatment of Carry-On that worsened whenever he became ill. 6 days after that visit, Carry-On was dead. The 2 surviving brothers were removed from the home on November 28. Felicia Adams, 52 at the time of her arrest, was Carry-On's maternal aunt who had legally adopted him and his 2 brothers in California in June of 2012 before relocating to Vancouver. Her husband, Jesse Castillo Franks, 56, was their adoptive father. Adams had received adoption assistance subsidies tied to the children's special needs, and prosecutors argued this formed part of the motive for keeping them. After the home was vandalized following media coverage, the couple fled. They were arrested in Stockton, California on June 4, 2021, and returned to Washington, each held on $1 million bond. A 2-week jury trial ran from October 16th through the 27th, 2023, in Clark County Superior Court. Each defendant faced charges of homicide by abuse, second-degree taking of a life, and 2 counts of criminal mistreatment. The defense argued that Carry-On's death was caused by pre-existing medical conditions. The jury convicted both on all 4 counts. On December 6, 2023, the judge sentenced Adams to 35 years and Franks to 30 years, calling the case one of the saddest things she had seen in 37 years on the bench. Adams and Franks remain incarcerated in Washington state custody. In July 2023, Seattle's Davis Law Group filed a combined $55 million tort claim against the state's Department of Social and Health Services and Department of Children, Youth and Families on behalf of Carry-On's estate and his 2 surviving brothers. alleging the agencies were inadequately trained to identify starvation abuse. Prosecutors noted that the pandemic and remote schooling had given the couple what they called a convenient cloak, reducing outside contact with the children to nearly zero. If you have been watching up to this point, consider subscribing. This series covers 10 cases, and the patterns between them are something you need to see. By 2020, pandemic lockdowns had closed the doors to schools, churches, and pediatric offices that served as the last line of defense for children like Carry-On Franks. And in Simpsonville, South Carolina, a 3-year-old named Victoria Rose Smith had just been placed with a family the state had cleared for adoption. The woman waiting to become her legal mother had recently won a nationally televised cooking competition. Ariel Robinson. Victoria Rose Smith had spent almost her entire short life in the care of the South Carolina Department of Social Services. She and her 2 older biological brothers entered foster care in early 2020, and by March of that year, the 3 children were placed with Ariel and Jerry Robinson of Simpsonville, South Carolina. Victoria was never legally adopted. The finalization was scheduled for January 19, 2021. That was January 2021. By January 14th, Victoria was gone. This story does not begin with the crime itself. It begins with the image Ariel Robinson had built for the world to see. Robinson was a former middle school teacher at Sanders Middle School in Lawrence County with a master's degree from Clemson. She had ambitions as a comedian and social media personality. In August of 2020, she won Season 20 of the Food Network competition Worst Cooks in America and its $25,000 prize, publicly telling audiences that the money would help support her family and 3 recently adopted children. On the evening of January 13, 2021, the family attended Bible study. A fellow church member named Avery Santiago later testified that Ariel had told her Victoria had shoved food into her mouth until she vomited. Santiago overheard Ariel speaking to Victoria in the bathroom, telling the child that girls who make themselves throw up deserve to be cold. The next morning, January 14th, after Jerry had left the home, Ariel physically harmed Victoria over the course of roughly an hour. According to Jerry's trial testimony, the trigger was that Victoria was eating her pancakes too slowly. When Jerry returned, he found Ariel standing over the child and told her she had gone too far. The couple attempted to treat Victoria's injuries at home. Jerry drove to a nearby CVS around 1 in the afternoon to buy medication, a trip confirmed by store surveillance and the store manager's testimony. They gave Victoria Tylenol. She became ill. She went limp. Jerry called 911 at roughly 2 in the afternoon, telling the dispatcher that the child had consumed too much water and that they had tried to perform CPR. Victoria was pronounced dead at Prisma Health Greenville Memorial Hospital. The Greenville County Chief Medical Examiner found multiple blunt force injuries that had caused deep internal bleeding. A pediatric intensive care physician who treated Victoria described her injuries as the worst she had seen in her career. Ariel and Jerry were both arrested on January 19th, 2021, the exact day Victoria's adoption was supposed to have been finalized. Jerry pleaded guilty on April 14th, 2022, to aiding and abetting homicide by child abuse. Ariel went to trial in May of 2022. The prosecution introduced body camera footage, autopsy photographs, medical testimony, Jerry's cooperating testimony, and Santiago's account of the Bible study evening. The defense argued Victoria's injuries could have been caused by CPR or by her 7-year-old brother. On the stand, Ariel called Victoria her mini-me, but on cross-examination agreed the child had been beaten severely. The jury deliberated for about 90 minutes before convicting. Judge Verdon immediately sentenced Ariel Robinson to life in prison. Jerry Robinson received 20 years, the maximum allowed under his plea. On May 28, 2025, the South Carolina Court of Appeals affirmed Ariel's conviction, rejecting her argument that graphic photographs had been improperly admitted at trial. Both remain in South Carolina Department of Corrections custody. Ariel has received multiple disciplinary sanctions in prison since her sentencing. Victoria was in state legal custody at the moment she was harmed fatally. The Department of Social Services stated publicly that its background check revealed no indication the Robinsons would harm a child. But the biological family alleged inadequate vetting, including reports the home was in foreclosure the month the children were placed. A 2020 Greenville County audit found that only 30% of sampled cases showed adequate efforts to assess child risk. More than 42,000 people signed a petition urging legislation that would require frequent, unscheduled home visits for foster and adoptive parents and strengthen psychological evaluations of prospective parents. As of this writing, no comprehensive version of that proposed legislation has been enacted. Victoria's biological family had to petition family court simply to secure custody of her body for burial. This was not just about one family in South Carolina anymore. The same structural failures kept repeating across the country. And in Miami, one of those gaps had been open for nearly a decade before anyone found a 10-year-old girl's remains on the shoulder of Interstate 95. Jorge and Carmen Barahona. On Valentine's Day, 2011, a contractor for the Florida Department of Environmental Protection noticed a red Toyota pickup truck stopped on the shoulder of Interstate 95 in West Palm Beach. Inside the cab, a 10-year-old boy named Victor Barahona was unconscious and in medical distress. In the truck bed, concealed alongside containers of chemicals, were the remains of his fraternal twin sister Nubia. The driver, Jorge Barahona, was found nearby, incapacitated. But what investigators would soon discover was that this scene on the highway was not the beginning of the story. It was the end of one that had been unfolding for nearly a decade. Richland Township, Pennsylvania, Westport, California, Vancouver, Washington, Simpsonville, South Carolina, and now a Florida interstate. Nubia and Victor Dr. Barahona were born May 26, 2000, in Spokane, Washington. Their biological mother had already lost 4 older children to Child Protective Services. After a brief placement with their father, who was later charged with a separate offense involving another child, the twins entered Florida foster care in 2003 and were placed with Jorge and Carmen Barahona in the Westchester neighborhood of western Miami-Dade County. The Barahonas formally adopted Nubia and Victor in 2009. Despite documented concerns that included repeatedly missed medical appointments and a 2005 disclosure by Nubia at school that she was being abused in the home. For roughly a decade, the Florida Department of Children and Families had been involved with this household. A nurse had recommended the couple be barred from adopting because of chronic missed medical appointments. Teachers reported bruises, food stealing, and extreme hygiene neglect. DCF investigated the family at least twice before the adoption and had an open investigation at the time Nubia was harmed fatally. On February 10, 2011, a therapist treating the Barahona's granddaughter called Florida's abuse hotline after the granddaughter reported the twins were being physically restrained and mistreated in the home. A DCF investigator named Andrea Fleary was assigned the case. According to an independent panel later appointed by Governor Rick Scott, Fleary visited the home but never laid eyes on Nubia or Victor and did not return over the weekend, citing an inability to work weekends. Within days, Nubia had been harmed fatally inside the family home. The autopsy found blunt force trauma, dehydration, malnourishment, and injuries consistent with prolonged mistreatment. And somehow, it gets worse. After Nubia's death, Jorge loaded both her body and her living brother into his pickup truck and drove north. Victor was found in the cab in critical condition. That is the scene the contractor discovered on Valentine's Day morning. A Miami-Dade grand jury indicted both Barahonas in March 2011. DCF Secretary David Wilkins fired the investigator Fleary and her supervisor, Kevin Ramos. 5 additional employees were reprimanded. Wilkins described the agency's hotline as having what he called a low-cost call center mentality. The grand jury concluded that DCF's investigative practices had failed at a systemic level. Carmen Barahona pleaded guilty on February 21, 2020, to first-degree charges and multiple counts of aggravated child abuse, agreeing to testify against Jorge in exchange for life without parole. Jorge's case has stalled for more than 14 years. He was attacked by inmates in March 2021, fired his legal team that August, and cycled through multiple court-appointed attorneys. In March 2024, a judge declared him incompetent to stand trial. Then, on July 23, 2025, after a 2-day competency hearing, the judge reversed course and ruled him competent. Trial preparations resumed. Prosecutors have indicated they will seek the death penalty. Jorge Barahona, 58, remains at the Metro West Detention Center in Miami-Dade County awaiting trial. Carmen Barahona, 74, remains in custody pending sentencing. Victor, the surviving twin, is now an adult. The state paid $1.25 million in 2013 toward a $5 million settlement, and the Florida legislature approved the remainder via a claims bill signed by Governor Scott in 2017. The case triggered Florida's most sweeping child welfare overhaul in more than a decade. 80 new investigators in 2011, 270 more after a 2014 reform law, a complete overhaul of the abuse hotline, the creation of child death investigative teams, and upgraded information sharing databases. A follow-up grand jury praised the improvements, but warned that a narrow definition of neglect could mask the true count of children lost in the system. Sally Schofield. Sally Ann Schofield was not some stranger who slipped through a background check. She was a supervisor at the Maine Department of Health and Human Services, the very agency responsible for deciding which homes were safe for children and which ones were not. She reviewed case files, approved foster placements, and oversaw caseworkers for a living. And when she decided she wanted to become a foster parent herself, the system she worked for handed her 2 little girls. One of them would not survive. Chelsea, Maine, 2001. Logan Marr was 5 years old, a child who loved grape soda, butterflies, and the PBS cartoon Arthur. She and her younger half-sister Bailey had been removed from their biological mother, Christy Baker, and cycled through a series of foster homes before being placed with Schofield. The placement itself violated state rules because of Schofield's employment within the department. But nobody flagged it. Nobody stopped it. It was later established that Schofield could not even pass her own department's home study requirements for adoptive foster parenting, and that a private agency had been brought in to conduct one after the fact. On January 31, 2001, Schofield called for an ambulance. When paramedics arrived at her home in Chelsea, they found Logan unresponsive. Schofield told them the child had fallen from a high chair during a disciplinary timeout. Investigators were immediately suspicious. Logan's eyes showed hemorrhages consistent with suffocation, and the story did not match the evidence. What they found in the basement told a different story. During what Schofield described as a timeout, she had restrained Logan in a high chair using extensive amounts of duct tape, covering the child's mouth and partially blocking her airway. Schofield then closed the basement door and left her alone. Logan suffocated. The sentencing judge would later describe her death as slow, agonizing, and amounting to torture. Schofield's own personnel records noted that she insisted on doing things her way. At trial in 2002, Schofield was acquitted of the more serious charge, but convicted of manslaughter. She was originally sentenced to 28 years, with 8 suspended. On appeal, the Maine Supreme Judicial Court ordered a resentencing because Schofield had not been given the option of a jury trial on whether the crime met the threshold for the most severe sentence. The judge handed down the new maximum of 20 years. Schofield never expressed remorse. At no point during the trial or afterward did she accept that Logan died because of what she did. She maintained the child had suffered a seizure. Schofield was released from the Maine Correctional Center in Windham on April 25, 2017, after serving roughly 15 years. Her probation conditions prohibited contact with children under 12, except for her own and those of relatives, with supervision. She moved to the town of Thorndike. Logan's biological mother, Christy Darling, who was undergoing chemotherapy for lung cancer at the time of Schofield's release, said publicly that she could not believe it was happening and that there was no peace or justice for her daughter. Darling added that Logan's younger sister Bailey, then 18 years old, had spoken about missing all the things a big sister would have been there for. The case prompted sweeping changes to Maine's child welfare system. The number of children in foster care in the state was cut in half. Those still in the system became 3 times more likely to be placed with relatives rather than strangers. Caseworker visits increased from every 3 months to at least once a month. The Annie E. Casey Foundation later recognized Maine's reformed system as a national model. Bailey, Logan's younger sister, was returned to her mother after the death. The PBS series Frontline ran a 3-part investigation into the case, titled Failure to Protect, that raised questions about why the state removed Logan from her mother in the first place, only to place her in a home where a department supervisor would take her life. Sarah Packer in Pennsylvania, Sally Schofield in Maine. Both worked inside the child welfare system. Both used that position to place children under their own roof. And both exploited the blind spots they knew better than anyone. The next case starts not with the perpetrator, but with a scene that investigators in Florida will never forget. Avontai, Devon. In November of 2023, Fayetteville police responded to a home on Berrydale Drive for a mental health crisis involving a juvenile. During the response, the young person in crisis told officers something that opened a case unlike anything the department had seen. He said he had not seen his brother Blake in approximately 5 years, that the last time he saw him, Blake had a broken arm, and that Blake was now dead. In 5 years, nobody from any government agency had asked where Blake was. Blake Devon is believed to have died in 2017 at approximately age 11. London Devon is believed to have died in 2019. Forensic testing identified the second set of remains as a female between 15 and 19 years old. Both had been adopted by Avontai Devon, 63 at the time of her arrest, who had been a licensed North Carolina foster parent from 2007 to 2013 through a nonprofit called Grandfather Home, later known as Children's Hope Alliance. Between those years, she adopted 5 unrelated children from 3 different North Carolina counties. After the adoptions, Devon moved the family to Fayetteville in 2015 and homeschooled all 5 children, effectively severing every connection they had to mandated reporters. According to police and sworn warrants, the 3 oldest adopted children were subjected to prolonged confinement, food deprivation, and denial of basic hygiene and medical care. What the investigation uncovered was staggering in scope. Children could earn food by writing hundreds of lines of apology paragraphs. When badly injured, they were given what Devon called natural cures rather than medical care. Police allege Blake died in 2017 after prolonged starvation and physical abuse. His remains were disposed of, with Devon reportedly forcing another child in the household to assist. London died under similar circumstances roughly 2 years later. In April of 2024, investigators recovered partial skeletal remains from multiple locations, including a metal burn barrel in Autryville containing 2 separate sets of human remains. And no, I'm not making that up. 2 children, 2 burn barrels, and 5 years of silence. Over the months following the initial disclosure, Police and the FBI learned that Devin had enlisted a family acquaintance to impersonate Blake during a Cumberland County Department of Social Services visit. She had maintained the fiction that all 5 children were alive for years while continuing to collect adoption assistance benefits. Devin was arrested at her home on June 26, 2024, and held without bond. The Cumberland County District Attorney called the allegations some of the worst he had seen in nearly 25 years. On March 10, 2026, a grand jury indicted Devin on 7 counts, including 2 first-degree charges, 2 concealments of death, kidnapping, and child abuse. In April of 2026, prosecutors filed notice that the state would pursue the death penalty. Trial is not expected before 2027 due to the scale of the evidence. Devin remains in state custody without bond. North Carolina's foster care system is state-supervised but county-administered, meaning 100 counties have operated separate data systems with no unified oversight. Devin adopted across 3 of those counties, and none cross-referenced their files. In June of 2025, Governor Josh Stein signed House Bill 612, the Fostering Care in NC Act, giving the state expanded authority over county social services records and tightening investigation deadlines. The state simultaneously launched Path NC, the first unified digital system tracking foster children across all 100 counties in real time. Blake's biological mother, Felicia Chandler, has publicly expressed concern that one of her surviving sons will age out of foster care before she can re-establish contact. From a burn barrel in rural North Carolina to a brownstone in Greenwich Village, the distance is roughly 500 miles. The next case happened more than 30 years earlier, in 1987. But the pattern is identical. A child who was never legally protected, placed with people the system never properly vetted, and harmed in a home where neighbors and teachers saw the signs and said nothing. Joel Steinberg. On the evening of November 1st, 1987, inside a brownstone apartment at 14 West 10th Street in Greenwich Village, the same building where Mark Twain once lived, a 6-year-old girl named Lisa was fatally harmed by the man who was raising her. His name was Joel Steinberg, a 46-year-old criminal defense attorney. After the attack, Lisa fell unconscious. Steinberg left the apartment to have dinner with a friend. His partner, Hedda Nussbaum, a former children's book editor at Random House, stayed behind with Lisa and their 16-month-old son, Mitchell. She did not call for help. She later testified that she was waiting for Steinberg to come back because she believed he would be able to wake Lisa up. When Steinberg returned, the couple did not call an ambulance. Instead, they smoked freebase cocaine for several hours. It was not until the following morning, November 2nd, that Nussbaum finally dialed 911, telling the dispatcher that her daughter had choked on food and had been falling a lot on her roller skates. When paramedics arrived, Lisa was unresponsive and showed extensive signs of abuse and neglect. The apartment was in a state of profound squalor, with no working lights and garbage throughout. Police found cocaine, hashish, and $25,000 in cash. 16-month-old Mitchell was found in deeply neglected conditions. Nussbaum herself had 2 black eyes, a split lip, a broken nose, a fractured jaw, and 9 broken ribs, all from Steinberg. Lisa was rushed to St. Vincent's Hospital, where doctors found bleeding in her brain and bruises across her head, spine, and body in varying stages of healing. She never regained consciousness. 3 days later, she was declared brain dead. Her life support was removed on November 5th, 1987. Lisa had never been legally adopted. Her birth mother, Michelle Launders, had been 19 years old and unable to care for a baby. She paid Steinberg $500 to arrange a proper adoption with a Catholic family. Instead, Steinberg kept the child. No legal adoption papers were ever filed, meaning no home study was ever conducted and no caseworker ever visited. Mitchell had been obtained through similarly irregular circumstances. Neither child had any legal protection. At trial in 1988, Nussbaum became the prosecution's key witness after medical examination revealed she was physically incapable of inflicting the injuries that harmed Lisa fatally. Charges against Nussbaum were dropped. Over 7 days on the stand, she described years of abuse at Steinberg's hands and detailed the events of that night. The jury convicted Steinberg of first-degree manslaughter. The judge imposed the maximum sentence of 8 1/3 to 25 years. More than 1,000 mourners attended Lisa's funeral, including Cardinal John O'Connor. Her birth mother won a court fight to prevent Steinberg from burying the child and had his name removed from the death certificate, which now reads simply, Baby Girl Launders, also known as Lisa. Mitchell was returned to his birth mother, who renamed him Travis. Steinberg served roughly 17 years at the Southport Correctional Facility in protective custody. He was denied parole 5 times, largely because he never expressed remorse. On June 30th, 2004, he was released under the state's good time law. He was disbarred and took work in construction. As of the last public reporting, he was living in Harlem. He has continued to deny responsibility for Lisa's death. The case transformed child abuse awareness in New York and across the country. Abuse hotline calls surged, with the New York Department of Social Services reporting nearly 600 calls on a single Sunday after the story broke. A Board of Education investigation concluded that staff at Lisa's school, Public School 41, should have noticed the signs of abuse, but were not properly trained. At least 8 adults at the school had observed Lisa's disheveled appearance, her dirty fingernails, her matted hair, and unexplained bruises. Lisa sometimes walked herself to school, crossing busy Manhattan streets of 4 lanes of traffic, alone as a 6-year-old. Teachers later recalled she arrived with bruises and chunks of hair missing from her head, but no report was ever filed. Mandatory abuse recognition training for all school personnel was implemented statewide as a direct result. Neighbors in the building had also called police multiple times over the years to report Steinberg's abuse of Nussbaum, and investigators had visited the apartment on 2 prior occasions, but found nothing wrong. Joel Steinberg exploited a loophole in adoption law to obtain a child with no oversight whatsoever. The final case in this series involves a man who used the foster care system itself, not to protect a vulnerable teenager, but to exploit her trust and then to weaponize her. Kevin Knuffel. Lisa Knuffel was a social worker for the Cuyahoga County Department of Children and Family Services in Ohio, specializing in abuse cases. She spent her career trying to keep children safe. In 2009, she and her husband Kevin, a truck driver, had a daughter named Haley. They also had Megan, Lisa's daughter from a prior marriage. In July of 2011, the couple took in a 16-year-old foster child named Sabrina Zunick through Lake County. Sabrina had been in the custody of county officials for nearly a year and was eager to leave a group home called the Cayley Home and be placed with a family. Her attorney would later say that the people responsible for placing her thought it was a good fit. He called it the absolute worst thing that could have been done. Then, in the spring of 2012, Kevin Knuffel began exploiting his position of authority over Sabrina. The trust placed in him as her foster parent was betrayed. She was 17. He was 41. Court documents show that by that fall, Kevin's abuse of trust had escalated. He contacted Sabrina's social worker in October and asked whether the teenager could remain in his custody if he and Lisa divorced. On November 15, 2012, Kevin parked his car on the way to driving Sabrina to school, and according to her later testimony, began crying and told her he would take his own life if Lisa was not dead. Lisa had grown suspicious of Kevin's behavior toward the foster child and had told Sabrina to move out by January. The next morning, November 16, 2012, at roughly 1 in the morning, Lisa's 13-year-old daughter, Megan, called 911. She was screaming that someone was harming her mother. When police arrived at the Knofel home in Willoughby Hills, they found Lisa in the master bedroom. The scope of the violence was extreme. Sabrina Zunick was arrested at the scene. Kevin was on the road for work when it happened. He returned the next day, appeared to cooperate with the investigation, and attended Lisa's funeral. A co-worker of Lisa's later testified that at the funeral, Kevin's demeanor was emotionless. The morning after the attack, he had already called Lisa's workplace to ask about filing a claim on her life insurance policy. Prosecutors later established that the policy was worth nearly $800,000. With the payout, Kevin purchased a house in Florida, bought cars, and took flying lessons. For months, authorities treated Sabrina as the sole perpetrator. She pleaded guilty to aggravated taking of a life in 2014 and was sentenced to 30 years to life with the possibility of parole. But in August of 2013, Sabrina had begun cooperating with investigators. She testified that Kevin had planned the attack, coached her on when to carry it out while Lisa was asleep, and told her repeatedly that Lisa was worth more dead than alive. Kevin Knofel's trial began in May of 2014. The prosecution argued he had manipulated a vulnerable foster child's trust, exploited his position of authority over her, and then used that hold to push her into committing the act so he could collect the insurance money. The defense argued Sabrina was mentally unstable and acted alone. After 9.5 hours of deliberation, the jury convicted Kevin on all 11 counts, including 6 counts of misconduct involving a foster child, 3 counts of complicity, and 2 counts of conspiracy. He was sentenced to life in prison with the possibility of parole after 30 years. A Lake County judge later awarded $6.2 million in civil damages on behalf of Lisa's 2 daughters, who had both been present in the home that night. Megan Zanella, who was 13 at the time, heard the screams, came downstairs, and witnessed the attack. She later told an interviewer that she tried to intervene and was shoved aside. Kevin Knofel remains in Ohio State custody. Sabrina Zunick, who is now in her late 20s, remains incarcerated with the possibility of parole. At her sentencing, she told the court she was sorry for what she had done and that Lisa did not deserve what happened to her. Her defense attorney stated publicly that there should be no doubt in anyone's mind that she would not have done this without Kevin Knofel's urging. Lisa Knofel's colleagues at the Cuyahoga County Child Welfare Office have said publicly that she dedicated her career to protecting children from exactly the kind of person her own husband turned out to be.